All right, so this week I want to be talking about the musculoskeletal system, which is, really two different systems, the skeletal system and the musculature. But for they work very closely with each other and hold each other up, sort of make each other possibly functional. And so I'm going to kind of deal with them together. And so musculoskeletal system consists of the skeletal muscles, which is not all the muscles in the body, but the skeletal muscles, and the ones that attach to the bones of the skeleton, and which is as compared to or as contrasted with, for instance, the smooth muscles and the hard muscles that we talked about in the previous couple of classes. Smooth muscles in the respiratory and digestive system, heart muscle in the heart, obviously. And then most of the muscles in the body that are moved voluntarily they're attached to the skeleton. And they tend to work in pairs. So you'll have two muscles often on either side of a bone, or positioned such that when one muscle contracts, it moves the bone one way. When another muscle contracts, it moves the bone the other way. Or maybe it doesn't move a bone very much. Maybe it just sort of stabilizes them in place. But they tend to work in pairs and be attached to bones. And I'm not really going to get into in this class all the names of the different muscles. I'm going to talk more about different categories of muscles and types of muscle movement and things like that, and how that's relevant to us as herbalists and as people who might be providing care to people close to us. And the same with the skeleton. I don't think it's necessary for you to know all the names of all the bones in the body, although there aren't that many of them. And it is a good thing to learn, but I'm not going to really cover it in this class because it's not so much lecture material. It's more of a study on your own kind of thing. For anybody who's wanting to learn that, there are lots of good charts and diagrams out there that you can get for free, that you can find for free online. There's also a resource called the Anatomy Coloring Book, which I've recommended to people for years. And when my wife taught anatomy and physiology, she had her class use it. So it's a really good resource, and it's just kind of has all the different muscles and bones and things like that in the body. And you can color them in, but more importantly, it familiarizes you with where they are. So that's something that you could probably find online. That's not very expensive and can be a good learning resource that I think is a good thing for everybody to know about. So yeah, good stuff to learn all the specifics of on your own, but we're just going to kind of cover some of the basics and fundamental concepts related to the musculoskeletal system in the course of this lecture today. So I'm going to start with the bones, because the bones are sort of what everything's attached to, sort of the frame of the human body. Gives it its structure, gives the muscles the places to attach to. And of course, it's the most durable sort of tissue in the human body. Skeletal system tends to persist long after the rest of the body is gone under most circumstances. So, it's made out of hard tissue. Because it's hard tissue, it can be slower to heal when it is injured, and it can be harder to influence the healing of using medicines, be they herbal or otherwise. Now, the skeleton is not fully formed when we're born. There's still a lot of areas of the skeleton that are not fully mineralized. This process of mineralization consists of the body depositing minerals into a protein matrix. So when you start out, sometimes people will say that babies' bones are just cartilage. They're not really just cartilage, but they have their bones consist of a protein matrix that has minerals deposited into it. So there's this gelatinous, cartilaginous type of matrix, type of material. And then as we grow and as we age and as we use our skeletons and subject them to stress, the body deposits minerals into the tissue and makes it harder. So whereas you start out with bones that are mostly protein or are just cartilage in some places, then as you age, they get more and more dense with more and more mineral deposited into them. And some of you might remember from science classes in public school, there's a famous experiment that people will sometimes do where you can soak a bone in vinegar for a long time, and that removes the minerals from it. The acidity removes the minerals, leaches the minerals out of it, and you're left with a floppy, bone-shaped thing that is just the protein matrix, but it's like a flexible bone, kind of a rubbery sort of thing. So something similar can happen in the human body if you have too much acidity in your system. If you have acidosis, it can leach minerals from your bones. Also, if you don't have the right hormonal situation going on, you can lose mineralization from your bones. So as we grow, our bones get longer for a while. That protein matrix continues to grow, and eventually it all gets mineralized, and then the growing stops. And that tends to happen, in early adolescence, basically. Fairly early on into adolescence, people achieve their adult height, and then the bones get harder and harder for a while. And that can depend a lot on physical activity. Just like with muscle, bones get stronger from being exercised. There are certain hormones that cause the body to deposit minerals into the bones. Estrogen is one of them. Another one is called calcitonin. Calcitonin is produced in the thyroid gland, and to a lesser extent in the adrenal glands. There are also hormones that cause minerals to be released from the bones, because those minerals are not just there to make the bones harder. That is one of the things they do, is that they make the bones hard and they give it structure. But at the same time, the bones are acting as a storage place for these minerals like calcium, especially calcium, but not only calcium. So storage for these minerals, which the body also uses for other things, including conducting electricity in the nervous system. So the bones are actually a repository of minerals and of nutrients. And those same minerals are what give the bones their strength and hardness. And, I think it's really, really important to understand when you're thinking about healing with bones, that bones have, the bones get their fundamental structure from protein, not from calcium. The calcium is added into the protein, and if the protein is not there, the calcium is not the problem. So it's something that is not necessarily how we're taught to think of bones. When you hear various advertisements and things like that about what to do for your bone health, it's always about the minerals, but the protein side of things is really important too. And so that's something that adequate nutrition is especially important too. And it's also something to be aware of, that nutrition in childhood is very fundamental to this, because there's certain aspects of it that just are not really that changeable once you reach your full adult size. So if someone is malnourished as a child, they may have some difficulties with, for example, brittleness of their bones, that are not necessarily as far as I know, not necessarily something that can be completely corrected after the fact. So it's definitely, some of it's genetic, some of it is developmental, and some of it's nutritional. Some of it, some of it's the sort of thing that can be changed as you go along. But a lot of it is fairly strongly influenced by initial conditions, or conditions that might be long gone by the time that you as an herbalist are trying to intervene with someone or trying to help someone with bone health. Most of the time, people really only think about their bones under a couple circumstances. One is that they injure a bone, especially fracturing a bone. And the other is that they get weak bone density to the point where it's causing problems. And, maybe they'll have a diagnosis like osteopenia or osteoporosis, both of which are essentially just a diagnosis of decreased bone density. And they only differ in terms of severity. So osteopenia is a less severe loss of bone density. Osteoporosis is a more severe loss of bone density or bone mineralization. And the line between them is fairly arbitrarily drawn. But both of them result in more risk of fracture. Both of them result in less physical strength, because your muscles are cleverly set up not to tighten up so hard that they break your bones, and which they could totally do if there were not regulatory mechanisms in place to keep them from doing so. So those are kind of the only times when people really think that much about the usual times when people think that much about bone health. A lot of the time, it's just kind of like the bones are there, and people just aren't thinking that much about them or paying that much attention to what they need to do for them. So anatomists kind of classify bones into three broad categories that most of them fit into, which is long bones, short bones, and flat bones. Teeth are also kind of bones that are in a separate category or their own special category. So long bones are sort of what most people would picture in their mind when they imagine what a bone looks like. And so that's things like the bones of the arms or the legs, also the bones of the fingers, even though they're not that long, they're long relative to how wide they are. So they're considered long bones. The knuckle bones in the hand, the bones in the hand and foot, other than the phalanges, are short bones. They're just kind of like little gravel-like bones, small, round pieces, not completely round, but they're not very long compared to how wide they are, pieces of bone. And so those are the short bones. And then the flat bones would be more like the bones of the skull. So they're, flat, curved, but basically flat in shape. And all of these have, short bones don't have a lot of muscle attachments to them. They're mostly bound together with connective tissue, and they act sort of almost like ball bearings act in a machine. They kind of are for helping movement to happen in a very limited range, and helping there not to be a lot of friction on the joints or excessive leverage on certain joints in the body as you're using them. And then the flat bones are more to provide structure. They do have places where muscles anchor to them, but they don't have a whole lot necessarily of, the skull bones don't have a lot of movement relative to each other. They move very little. It's not true that they completely don't move. Sometimes people would used to characterize the joints of the skull as being fixed joints, but they're not completely fixed. They do move a little bit. Skulls are a tiny bit flexible, helps to keep them from cracking, and it also helps to perhaps move the cerebrospinal fluid around as they move. So those are some kind of broad categories of bones. Most of the bones that people think about and people use for large movement are the long bones, especially the bones, the arms and legs. But other so that those provide points of attachment for a lot of the strongest muscles in the body. So bones, when they are injured or when they are losing density for other reasons, it is possible to use herbs both to provide nutrients. Plants can be really good sources of calcium. There's kind of like a very long-term campaign by the dairy industry to get people to associate dairy with calcium. And dairy does have calcium in it, but it's far from the only source of calcium. And there are definitely at least some studies out there to suggest that it's not necessarily a great source of calcium, or that that some of the other things, the phosphates in dairy, maybe more than outweigh the amount of calcium that that the dairy contains. In other words, they might the increase in acidity caused by dairy, at least according to some research that was done here at the University of Kentucky back in the 90s, they were their finding was that the phosphates in dairy made you lose more calcium through your urine than you actually got from the dairy. So it was like you would actually get a net loss of calcium from consuming dairy. So that's not necessarily true for everybody all the time or anything like that. But it is kind of a strong contrary to the usual talking point that the dairy industry has put out for decades, that if you want strong bones, you need to consume dairy. And there are lots of cultures in this world where people don't consume dairy at all, and their bones are not notably weaker or anything like that. So it's completely it's a very manufactured idea. It's a very business oriented idea that that's where you need to get calcium from. It's something that's more marketing than science. And the important thing to remember about that is that dairy animals don't make calcium. They get it from plants. Calcium is a mineral. It's an element. It can't really be created or destroyed. It can only change forms, at least under normal circumstances. There are some very special circumstances in which calcium can, in fact, be destroyed, but none of them typically happen on Earth. It's something that's gotten from the ground and goes from the ground into the plants, and then from the plants into animals, including humans, including animals that humans eat also. But it's not something that is produced by animals. It's something that's present in the soil, or it isn't. Here in central Kentucky, we have lots and lots of calcium in the soil. It's kind of what the rocks here are made out of. The parent soil is made out of. So there's a lot of calcium in the soil and in the water that runs through the soil, and that's true in a lot of places, and in some other places it's less true. But in any case, calcium is geological in origin, so don't necessarily associate it with dairy, because that's not really where it comes from, even if it is there. Also, it's important to remember that calcium isn't the only mineral in the bones. There's also magnesium and potassium, which are which are, light metals, just like calcium is, that are present as oxides in the soil and in minerals, in the rocks in the ground, and find their way from there into the plants. So when somebody has issues with bone health that you're trying to help with, leafy greens are really a good nutritional source, plant-based source of calcium. There are also some herbs that help specifically with the endocrine side of things, with the mineralization of bones. And some of these are plants that contain isoflavones. Red clover is one of them. Other plants in the same family as red clover, the bean family, often have the same types of stuff in them. So they're all potentially helpful in that area. Wild yam is also something that has a history of use for bone health. Solomon's seal is another one. That's a plant that is a woodland plant here. It helps with, not specifically with bone density, but with healing of fractures. As herbalists, we don't typically diagnose fractures, but we often end up working with people who have had them and who know that they've had them and want some help in getting them to heal. And in a young, healthy person, a fracture will heal in a matter of several weeks to a few months. In some people, including a lot of older adults, it might not ever heal. So that's something that people might come to an herbalist for, or something that you might deal with in a family member or something like that. It's a very common situation in elderly people. Partly because of the way that the musculoskeletal system depends on each other. You tend to get weak bones and weak muscles at the same time, and that means that people fall, and that means that they get fractures. And so that's one of the biggest one of the biggest threats to quality of life when you're an old person is that you fall and break something and get a fracture that doesn't heal, and that interferes with your mobility and your ability to do things for yourself. So that's something that a lot of people deal with, and that that ends up being a life-changing health event for a lot of people. So increasing circulation is an important thing in that scenario. We've talked some about herbs that increase circulation last time, like cayenne. Cinnamon is another one. So those things can help, can sometimes help in that situation. And another thing that is really important, probably the most important thing, it's not necessarily herbal or dietary, but weight-bearing exercise is very important for strengthening bones. And this would include, you don't want to do a lot of weight-bearing on a fractured bone in a way that's going to exacerbate the fracture. But after it's knitted together, after it's healed some, then you do want to do weight bearing to kind of help it get back to its full strength. Like I said before, bones are strengthened by exercise, just like muscles are. Just a second. Bones are strengthened by exercising, and so it's really important to do weight-bearing exercise to get your body to deposit minerals in your bones. If they're not being stressed, if they're not being bent a little bit, because your bones are slightly flexible and they bend a little bit when you move, they bend a little bit when you bear weight, that sort of thing. If that's not happening to the bones, then they have a tendency not to remain mineralized. They have a tendency for those minerals to get taken up by the body and used for other things. It figures you're not using them, so why not just soak them back up and use them for other bodily functions that involve them. Let's see, had a question of what part of Solomon's seal is used. Yeah, the roots, the underground parts is what you would use for this, and what you would use for most uses. I'm not really, people don't use the leaves for much that I know of. So yeah, weight bearing exercise, even like lifting weights, lifting small hand weights is something I often have people do if they're concerned about bone density, because it seems to be pretty helpful, and it's something that, you know, even if somebody's not able to get up and move around very much, that they can do. I had a patient several years ago who was in her 90s, and she worked out with 1 pound hand weights all the time, you know, and it was just like a very light weight, very small weight, but she would use them, and they gave her bones enough exercise that they stayed strong for a long time. So that's a good thing to do. You know, when I say weight bearing exercise, that can be lifting weights, but it can also be walking. Just kind of depends on what the level of health of the person is, and, you know, what they're physically capable of doing. I don't like high impact exercise for much of anybody. I think that running is something you should really only do if someone's chasing you, at least as far as health wise. I mean, it can be fun and exciting and whatever, like other physical activities, but it's not necessarily good for your body. It's you know, it's a lot of impact. There's a lot of jarring. It's hard on the joints, and of course, if somebody already has existing threats to their skeletal system, then, you know, the possibility of falling or something like that could be a compelling reason not to do it as well. Yeah. Set up. Darn it. Ah. Okay. So that's some general stuff about the skeletal system, and then to tie that in with the muscular system, there are a lot of muscles, a lot more muscles than there are bones, really. And like I said, they tend to work in pairs. They tend to be voluntarily controlled, although sometimes they involuntarily tense up, which is a spasm, or do other things like that. But for the most part, they tend to be under direct intentional control of the person whose muscles they are. And they're like the bones. The muscles are there partly as a way of storing materials that can be used elsewhere in the body. If you think way back to when we talked about the liver weeks and weeks ago, one of the things the liver does is produce a type of carbohydrate called glycogen. And quite a lot of glycogen is stored in the liver, but a lot of it is also stored in the muscles. So that is, muscles are consumers of energy. They're pretty much consuming energy all the time, because even when you're not using a muscle actively, there's usually some degree of tension in that muscle. So it's using some energy. And the glycogen is there so that when there's a surge in demand for energy, the muscles can release the glycogen and turn it into energy, which they can then use to turn the energy into movement. So muscles create heat, they generate heat, and they carry out a lot of cellular respiration, which is the process by which glucose is converted into energy and creates waste products in the body. If muscles are overused or if they're damaged, well, as muscles are used, muscle fibers break down, muscle cells break down and have to be replaced. When that happens a lot, that's how you build muscle tissue, is actually some of it gets torn or broken or worn out and gets replaced by new muscle tissue. So exercise makes muscles stronger and also visibly bigger in some cases. For some people, that happens more easily than others, which is also partly hormonal, partly due to anabolic steroids that are produced in the body, like testosterone, but not limited to that at all either. So there are muscle cells constantly being created and constantly being broken down. And when they're broken down, that protein from those muscles has to be filtered out of the blood. And if too much of that is happening, which chiefly happens either when somebody is training really hard or exercising really hard, or if there's been an injury, then you get a situation where the kidneys can get overloaded with protein. In the normal course of things, there's just a little bit of that going on at any given time. You know, the kidneys are more. Ideally, one kidney should be able to handle what goes on normally, as far as muscles being broken down and repaired. So if you have two kidneys, then you do have some redundancy built into the system. So, you know, it's not so likely that it will get overloaded, but it's definitely something that does put some strain on the kidneys, and that the kidneys are involved in. So the muscles, you know, of course, the main thing that they need nutritionally is protein, but they also do need energy, and they also need various different vitamins and things to make them function the way that they're supposed to. So, and minerals are very involved as well. Bones get their strength from when the minerals are deposited, and muscles get their strength from when the minerals are withdrawn. So when you tense up your muscles, you're using some minerals to do that. Some calcium is being used in your muscles, some sodium, potassium, all these different minerals that are involved in the contraction of muscles are being used. So, and that's why, you know, part of the reason why we constantly need to be taking in and are constantly excreting electrolytes is because the muscles are using them. So muscles get their strength from minerals being expended or withdrawn from the system, and bones get their strength from minerals being deposited into the system. So it's very important that you have electrolytes for muscle health and for muscle function. If you start to get, if you start to have not enough of any given electrolyte, then you can get some cramping and things like that. Often when people have cramps or Charlie horses, things like that, one of the things that can be wrong there, and one of the things that will fix that situation, is that it might be a deficiency of one or the other of the electrolytes. Usually it's not sodium. Sodium is almost always well covered by people's diets. That wouldn't necessarily be true if you were living in the woods, but if you're in society, salt's really easy to come by, and it's in just about everything that's prepared. So most people get more than enough salt, but it's much easier to become deficient in potassium, which kind of acts as the counterbalance to sodium, or in calcium or magnesium, which act as counterbalances to each other and are responsible for a different type of a different part of the nervous system having its having electricity conducted through it. So in general, we talk about muscle movement in terms of flexion and extension. Usually, so flexion is when a muscle tightens up, extension is when it stretches out. Usually it stretches out as a result of a different muscle tightening up. So if you're just sort of in a completely relaxed state and you were floating in water, maybe you'd be in something like a fetal position. But if you straighten your body out, you're using certain muscles to straighten it out. If you curl it up into a tight ball, then you're using certain other muscles to curl it up into a tight ball. Same with your arm. If you extend it out to your side, you're using one set of muscles to do that. If you curl it up, then you're using a different one. So flexion and extension of muscle pairs is a big part of how the body works. Muscles are really only capable of pulling. So all the action of your body is a muscle somewhere pulling on a bone. Even if it's creating an overall effect of pushing, it's because something attached to the bone in a particular place is pulling on that part of it to make the extension happen. So that's just kind of an overview of the musculature. Like I said, if you want to learn about different muscle groups, different specific names for muscles, there are a lot of them. There are some that are not very much paid attention to, and there are some that are, maybe much like the biceps and triceps that are involved in movement of the upper arm. Those are going to be a lot more noticeable, and probably a lot more important for you to know about than muscles that might not have a very direct influence on movement. Just a minute, I'll be right back, and then I'm going to talk some about muscle injury. All right. So everybody's still here. So, so muscle injury, there's various different types of muscle injury. The most common thing that happens with muscles is just soreness after overexertion. And this is a very normal, it's not really even an injury. It's just kind of what happens when you use your muscles a lot. Although if it's severe, it can be painful and it can interfere with people's ability to do things. So the most basic thing you can do for that is heat. Hot water, hot shower, hot bath, being in the sun, laying on a hot rock like a lizard, something like that. All very basic things that you can do. A hot water bottle or a hot towel put on an area, or a heating pad even, can be really helpful. I also use moxibustion a lot for sore muscles, which is very targeted, very high temperature heat created by burning the herb mugwort and holding it near certain points on the muscles. That's something I'll probably do a workshop on at the weekend intensive towards the end of the program, and something to keep in mind. So those are things that are useful for sore muscles. Anti-inflammatories can be helpful. Fluids can be really helpful. Just making sure that you're getting enough water. Like I said, use of muscles puts some strain on the kidneys. Most of the time, it's not really trying for the kidneys. It's not really that testing to them because they're built to be more than adequate. But sometimes it can be helpful just to sort of flush all the people used to say that there was a buildup of lactic acid in the muscles, and that's kind of not necessarily true. It might be true to some extent, but how true and how significant that is definitely debatable. But it does seem to help to get extra fluids, and maybe it's washing some of the breakdown products out of the system. Kind of increasing in severity from that. Sometimes people will have torn muscles or overextended muscles where they've actually hurt the muscles by using them in a way that causes some physical damage, usually some minor physical damage to the muscles. In those situations, I really like topical anti-inflammatories. I've talked about the wintergreen salve that I use, which is kind of comfrey, and it's an oil infusion of comfrey thickened with beeswax, and then with some oil of wintergreen added to it, which is an anti-inflammatory. So that's a really nice thing to rub into sore muscles or injured muscles. And with those muscles, if there is an actual something that's causing severe pain, usually there will be certain trigger points where you can press on it and it will feel much more severe. And usually with sore muscles that are just from exertion, a lot of the time that will be worse the day after the exertion and quite a bit better the day after that if there isn't any new exertion to it. With a torn muscle or overextended muscle, strained muscle, it's not necessarily going to be like that. It might be still very bad on the second day after the insult happens. So that's something that's a possible way of differentiating them, although it can be difficult. But in those cases, anti-inflammatories are really helpful. Maybe some of the best things that you have for them. Just a second. Uh, a more severe situation comes about when someone actually bruises or crushes a muscle, which, it can be severe crush injuries can be a very bad situation, sometimes a surgical situation. But a lot of the time with minor ones, there's just not that much you can do about them. And so the best thing that you can do is keeping the area warm, using warming rubs, things like cayenne salve or cayenne liniment, to keep circulation strong in that area, and then supporting the kidneys as they deal with getting rid of the breakdown products of the muscle, and then along with that, anti-inflammatories and pain management and that sort of thing. With modern people, um, we don't do nearly as much. Most of us don't do nearly as much using our muscles as people did a few generations ago, back before we had a lot of machinery and modern conveniences and things like that. People would often spend, a lot of their day walking. People would often spend a lot of their lives doing physical labor. And for some of us, that's still what we do, and for some of it's not. But for people who are more sedentary, there is definitely more of a risk of hurting your muscles when you try to use them. And then by contrast, for people who are in very physical jobs, sometimes there's more of a risk of over working your muscles and wearing them out faster than you would if you were doing just sort of less intensive uses of their muscles. For example, when I was I guess I was about 20, I worked unloading trucks at a store, and everything came off the truck on a conveyor belt, and you had to lean over, pick it up, turn, and put it on the right cart for it to go to the right part of the store that it was supposed to go to. So you were repeatedly doing this process of bending forward and twisting with something heavy in your hand. And this is very hard on your muscles and very hard on the skeleton of your lower back, the joints of your lower back in particular. So a lot of people who worked at that job, I was only there seasonally. I came in because it was around Christmas time, and they hired a bunch of extra people for those few months. But a lot of the people that I worked with who were there for longer had major back injuries and things like that. And I think we see that a lot with a lot of jobs that require sort of unnatural and repetitive motion. And that's a very big thing to see in our society. And the kind of conventional treatment for this is to just sort of ignore it until it gets too severe to ignore anymore. And then at that point, put people on opiates, and until those become too severe to deal with anymore. So that's not really a very not a very life affirming approach to dealing with that. And while the ideal situation is to avoid having a job that does that to your body, that's not always possible. And sometimes, maybe sometimes for a lot of people, that's just kind of something that already happened and the damage is already done. So for us, the role that we would be taking would be to try and nurture those muscles, nurture those joints and skeletal components, and try and regain some suppleness, decrease pain, and increase range of motion. So sometimes herbs that contain some emolliency, like marshmallow or like sea moss, which I think are both ones that we've talked about already. Yeah. Sometimes herbs like that will actually help with stiffness and pain from repetitive movement injuries. And then, of course, anti-inflammatories are really important. And also vulneraries, things like heal all and even yarrow taken internally can sometimes help with healing repetitive use injuries like that. And then, of course, topically, like I said, warming things can be helpful. Sometimes it's possible to combine warming and cooling ingredients in the same salve or liniment, but warming things are often more helpful for cold type pains, which repetitive use injuries often are. So if you have something where somebody's been using their wrists or their lower back repeatedly in a way that's causing long-term injury and pain, sometimes warming herbs topically can be helpful, anti-inflammatories internally, and then lubricating herbs, basically slippery herbs like sea moss can be helpful for that as well. Dietarily, it's important to get enough protein and enough fat. And then physically, it's important to be able to, if at all possible, rest that area of the body and not subject it to continued insult, continued injury. All right, so that's just kind of a general overview of skeletal and muscle function and some of the things that we do, some of the strategies we might employ when they're injured. Any questions about that? Okay, I want to talk, the first herb that I want to talk about is red clover. So red clover contains a class of substances called isoflavones, and pretty much everything in the bean family contains these, but red clover is one of the sources that has a lot of history of use, specifically of being used medicinally for its component of these substances. Isoflavones are sometimes called phytoestrogens because they have some effects that are similar to estrogen in the body, but they're not structurally like estrogen. They don't actually have much in common as far as the actual molecule with the estrogen that's in somebody's body naturally. Let's see. Red clover contains several different isoflavones. Two in particular, called genistein and diadzine, are ones that have been researched a lot, but there are many more besides those, and probably some that we don't really have the names of or anything like that yet. But those are two that are well known, and there are a few others in red clover that are known, and there are probably some additional ones that are not known. In addition to that, it contains minerals and it contains some protein too. Although you don't really get much of it from taking it as a medicinal preparation. Cows get a lot of protein from eating it out of the ground, but we don't really consume it in that kind of quantity normally. So the flower of red clover is the part that's typically used. If you're gathering it for your own use, the leaves contain some of the same stuff. They also contain some starches that can cause gas in some people, which the flowers have little or none of. But it is possible to use the whole above ground part of the plant, even though the commercial part used is the flower. If you look at a red clover flower, it's actually like a tiny ball of little flowers. One inflorescence, one flower head from red clover probably contains about 30 or so tiny pink pea blossom shaped flowers. Red clover seeds for sprouting are also a commercially available thing. And red clover sprouts are an excellent source of isoflavone. And they actually have quite a bit more of the isoflavones than the flowers have. So if you want to make a strong red clover preparation for yourself, you could eat the sprouts, or you could also dry them and make a tincture out of them as well. And that would be a very powerful way to make it. So because it is estrogenic, because it does, well, let's see, let me back up a little bit. When red clover acts like estrogen in the human body, it acts like a very weak estrogen. It attaches itself to the estrogen receptors, which are sort of the places on the cell that estrogen would attach to, and sort of in attaching there, activate certain processes within the cells, release of certain chemicals and things like that. So red clover will attach to those places and stimulate those processes, but it will do it much more weakly than natural estrogens. There's a few different kinds of estrogen in the human body. Estradiol is probably the strongest one, and it's about 100 times as strong as red clover, as the isoflavones that are in red clover. So if you're putting red clover into somebody's system who already has a lot of the stronger estrogen in their bloodstream, it's actually going to get in the way of that estrogen and keep it from doing its job, keep it from being able to attach to those receptor sites, which is going to mean a decrease in total estrogenic activity. In other words, it will act like having less estrogen in your body than if you hadn't taken the red clover. In a person who doesn't have much estrogen in their body, especially a man or a postmenopausal woman, or somebody who, for whatever reason, just doesn't produce much estrogen, then adding it in will increase the total amount of estrogenic activity in the body, because it's attaching to receptor sites that wouldn't have otherwise had anything on them. So it can actually increase or decrease the amount of estrogenic activity in the body, and it seems to tend towards a fairly healthy middle ground in most people. Sorry, I need to plug my phone in. Oh. All right. So the question was, so perhaps the red clover would not be ideal for someone who was on hormones or on hormone therapy. And maybe and maybe not. It kind of depends on if the hormone therapy is creating an adequate amount of estrogenic activity, then it's probably not necessary. But if it's not, if it doesn't seem to be doing as much as you would like it to do, then the red clover is a reasonable thing to try. Because sometimes people are taking hormone therapy and they're getting some benefit from it, but they don't necessarily want to increase the dose, because increased dose means increased risk of certain cancers and things like that. So in that case, it might actually they might still have less than an ideal amount of estrogenic activity going on, in which case it could still be helpful. So yeah, it could still go either way, just kind of depending on, I go more by clinical presentation, like is the person having hot flashes and night sweats, for instance, and if they still are, even though they're on hormones, sometimes they'll still be having them, but it'll be less than they used to be or something like that. And in that situation, it might still be an appropriate thing to try. And it's a pretty safe thing to try. It's a pretty uncomplicated thing to try. If anything weird happens, you just stop using it. If it seems to be having the opposite effect of what you want and you stop using it, then that's going to be pretty transitory. It's going to go back to normal pretty quickly. So when gathering red clover, it's important to gather it from healthy places because it does accumulate minerals. If it's growing in soil where there's heavy metals or anything like that, it's going to soak them right up. And it will grow in places like that. It doesn't mind. It's very tolerant to pollution, and it will absorb that pollution into itself. So you want to, and it often does grow in disturbed ground. Here in the United States, it's not a native plant. It was brought over here as cattle forage. You can seed a field with it, and it'll grow high protein pasture for cattle and other animals like them. And also you can grow clover on top of a field that you're not growing any crops in and plow it back under, and it'll sort of act like fertilizer. We'll take nitrogen from the air and put it into the soil. But a lot of the red clover that's sold is actually coated in pesticides and things like that, and sprouting inhibitors and things like that. This is not like if you were buying it for sprouting, but if you were buying it, if it were something that was like from the seed store, like Southern States or somewhere like that, it's often going to be coated with chemicals, which is not necessarily something that you want. So, try and gather red clover that is growing on its own, not something that's been grown for that sort of purpose, and that is growing in a safe and clean environment, which is true of just about any herb, but I feel like it's a particular concern with red clover. So if you don't gather your own, there's also very good biodynamic red clover or organically grown red clover available out there for sale. So it is something that can be purchased in a fairly good way. It's not an environmentally sensitive plant in the sense of being endangered or at risk or anything like that. And it is something that people do grow commercially in a clean and good way. I always personally prefer to gather things myself because then I know exactly where they've been. And I encourage you all to at least try doing it that way and see what you think of it. But sometimes circumstances don't permit that, and it can be okay to buy stuff too. So yeah, that's one of the main uses of red clover. Some people also consider red clover pretty helpful as a liver supporting herb. I used to use it some as a liver supporting herb. It's definitely something that in the community I grew up in Eastern Kentucky, that was like kind of more the primary thing that people would have thought of for red clover. Something for helping the liver heal, like after somebody had been on a drinking binge or something like that. Cool. question of how long would I say that the pesticides stay a problem on red clover sown from the feed store? I don't really know. I mean, at least for that year, but I'm not really sure whether that would persist the following year. Yeah, I'm not really sure about that. I'd probably give it a couple of years, though. I wouldn't not want to use plants that had been directly grown from those seeds. Although red clover, once it's in the field, it will persist there unless something drastic happens to get rid of it. So hang on a second. Oh, yeah. All right. So yeah, where I grew up, it was more something that people used as a liver supporting herb. Most of the time, I don't use it that way now. I've just kind of found other things that I like better, but it is one of its traditional uses. It is something that it's good for, and so that's another thing to know about it. Just a second. Yes, if I think if it were more than 10 years, yeah, I would say that that would be fine. I would expect that there wouldn't be anything that would persist for that long, as far as uh, those sorts of organic chemicals, carbon-based chemicals that they would likely break down in that amount of time. So yeah, red clover is also helpful with circulation. So it is something that's kind of somewhat supportive to the circulatory system. Maybe has a protective effect on the heart. So it's not something that's going to have any dramatic immediate effect on heart function, but it might have a protective effect by helping with circulation in general. If you read about red clover, you might find some things saying that it's blood thinning. It's not really if it's handled properly. We know from things that have happened with cattle that have been fed moldy red clover hay that it can become a blood thinner when it molds, but it's not really a significant problem with fresh red clover. So it's a pretty safe herb. I mostly consider it nutritive. I haven't seen a lot of problems with it at all in the course of my practice. I did see one time someone who began lactating when they were drinking about a liter a day of red clover tea, but that's kind of an excessive amount to drink of it. It's, maybe just overdoing it a bit. If they'd had a cup a day instead of a liter a day, it probably would have been fine. Not that it caused them any harm or anything like that. They were just sort of surprised by it. Concerned by it, but it was it stopped when they stopped taking so much of it. So that's like the closest thing I've seen to a problem from red clover, and under some circumstances that would not be a problem. So it's a pretty safe, generally recognized as safe and pretty well tolerated medicinal plant. Just a second. Yeah. So another plant that I wanted to talk about today, kind of an unusual one, is silphium or cup plant. This is a plant that that grows around here. It's not really much used commercially as an herb. Um, it's a tall plant that's in the sunflower family. It has yellowish flowers, and it has this interesting setup where the stem, well, the leaves, the pairs of leaves that grow on either side of the square stem are fused around the stem into a sort of cup shape. So it gives the appearance of the leaf coming up through the middle of a cup or bowl-shaped leaf, the stem coming up through the middle of a cup-shaped leaf, which collects water in it when it rains. And so it's an interesting and distinctive looking plant. I thought that I had a photo of it on here, but I don't. But I do have a little video of it on my Instagram if anybody wants to look at that. And it's something that can be used for topically for muscle aches and pains, for minor injuries. Can also be used internally as a decongestant. So this plant contains some resins, which are kind of sticky fluids within the plant that the resins contain some substances called terpenoids, which are aromatic compounds that evaporate. And as they evaporate, they take heat away with them. So when they're crushed up and put on the skin, they have a cooling feeling, like they're drawing heat out of the system, out of the body, and out of sore muscles and things like that. So this would be something that would be used as a poultice, or it could be made into an infusion, and the infusion could be applied topically. For instance, you could crush up the plant and boil it in water for a few minutes and strain it. The boiling will actually help. You don't want to boil it for a long time because you'll cook off the resins. But if you just bring it to a boil, it's going to help to melt the resins out of their solid form and get them to disperse into the liquid. And whereas just pouring boiling water over it might not do that so well. So then that could be, you could soak a washcloth in it, for instance, or a piece of cloth and put that on the skin. And that would be getting the active substances from the plant onto an injury like a minor cut, small bruise, or just a sore aching muscle. And so this also has one of its traditional names is carpenter's plant, because it's something that I think because of its usefulness for the sorts of minor injuries that you might get while doing carpentry. There's another plant called carpenter's woundwort, which is a completely different plant, but is maybe named for the same reason. It's just kind of the sort of thing that you would use under that circumstance. So this is a plant that is in flower right now, or it's kind of coming to the end of its flower right now. It's if you live in this part of the world, you might be able to find it. But I would encourage everybody to look it up and see what it looks like, and see if you see any of it growing around. There are a lot of other things that look similar to it as far as the flower goes, just basically a small sunflower style flower. It's distinctive once you get to know it, once you're used to looking at it. but at first glance, it looks just a lot like a lot of other small sunflower type plants. And so it's um, the leaf is the thing about it that's the most distinctive rather than the flower. So it's got a very recognizable type of leaf that's not readily confused with anything else around. So that's you know, a good I guess a good sort of practical skill is learning to recognize things from the leaves sometimes rather than the flowers. Just a second. All right. So yeah, so there are a lot of plants like that that are more traditionally used topically for healing minor injuries. You know, yarrow is one we've talked about before. Healol is another one. Um, I think that in clinical practice, it's easy for me to lose sight of how many herbs are used topically for short-term things, because mostly people aren't coming to me for first aid when I'm in the clinic. When I'm in the medicine wagon, they are, but when I'm in the clinic, people aren't usually coming to me for first aid type stuff. But it's really important skill set for herbalists to have, especially when dealing with people close to you. So you know, learning about topical uses of vulneraries is a really important thing. It's a good idea to know about as many of these as you can, because you're not always going to have your entire medicine kit with you, and maybe you'll be out in a field somewhere and somebody will get injured, and you can just pick the plant and crush it up and use it immediately. And that's a very powerful thing to be able to do, and very I don't know, it feels good to be able to do it, and it's very helpful to the people that you're doing it for. So I definitely encourage everybody to do that. And it's also really hard to mess up the use of a topical in a way that would cause anybody any real harm. All right, so yeah, cup plant. Go to my Instagram if you want to see a short video of it. Just kind of looking at it and give you a chance to see what it looks like. And if it grows where you live, try and see if you can go outside and find some. All right. Any questions about red clover or about cup plant?
I have a question about red clover.
Yeah.
Would it be a good herb in assisting young girls who are, I guess, just beginning puberty and developing and things like that, for like sore breasts caused by hormonal issues, things like that?
People have used it that way. I usually would go for red clover instead, because it's going to have a more indirect effect. And the thing about doing something with a direct effect on the endocrine system is that there's a lot going on at any given time. And especially in that scenario, there's many different substances, many different hormones that are kind of being scaled up in production and so forth. So it might make things slightly worse, or it might not have the effect that you want it to have. For example, if it might make somebody have a heavier period than they were used to, for instance. whereas red clover really won't tend, I mean, red raspberry leaf really won't tend to do that. It's, more just sort of increasing circulation to the reproductive system, and then letting the reproductive system sort out which of its substances it feels like it needs. So it's something that has been used that way for sure, but I feel like that's maybe a little too strong of an intervention, or like more of an intervention than I would usually want to engage in that scenario. Whereas the raspberry leaf would be more indirect and sometimes more helpful, or have a more have a larger likelihood of addressing whatever it is that needs to be addressed in that particular person at that particular time, which could be estrogen, but it could also be a bunch of other things.
The reason I asked that question, I'll just be frank, my daughter is kind of at that stage in life, and her biggest complaint is sore boobs. And so it's
Yeah,
really hard to help her, and I don't like to give Tylenol, things like that. So
yeah. Uh, heat topically sometimes helps, like a hot water bottle or a heating pad or something like that. But yeah, the raspberry leaf, especially if it's not just when it's happening, but if it's like not necessarily an everyday thing, but a frequent thing, it's going to provide nutrients that are helpful and things like that. It's probably going to do some good. In that particular scenario, the clover really might intensify the situation.
great, thank you.
Yeah. And okay, just briefly, wanted to remind everybody that October 8th is going to be the next plant walk. And my plan right now is for us to do that at Heisel Farm Park, where we did the first one, which some of you came to, and but to go to a different part of the park and see some. Well, we'll start out at the same place by the barn there where the parking is, but then we'll go a different direction and maybe see some other things, and should be able to get a look at what's changing in the environment this time of year, and how fall is just sort of getting started. I mean, it'll be, more underway by that point, but it won't be kind of at the peak yet. But look at the process of things, the plants preparing themselves for winter, and also the animals using the plants to help themselves prepare for winter. And we'll get to see all of that going on, various different natural processes that are part of that cycle, and hopefully see some new plants as well. And yeah, this time my plan is to have somebody help me record the whole thing and have 2-hour-long video or whatever, kind of go showing the whole process for those who are not able to come personally. This question: do I find red clover helpful with skin conditions? Yeah, red clover does help sometimes with skin conditions for sure, especially like, for example, hormonal acne. Somebody's having acne where they're breaking out on their back a lot. Is really helpful with that. If it helps with acne in general some of the time, and some of the time it doesn't, because acne is kind of weird like that. It's sort of non-linear. It's not always the same set of things leading to the outcome, but if it tends to be hormonally triggered, then it's often very helpful for that. With autoimmune conditions, including eczema and including psoriasis as well, there is sometimes some benefit from using red clover too, just because its influence on the endocrine system is going to have an effect on how the body produces anti-inflammatory steroids that that are part of what would naturally be used to deal with those situations. So yeah, there are definitely situations in which this can be helpful for skin conditions. I don't really think of it as a skin specific herb. I think of it more as something that works on the endocrine system, which in turn has a lot of effect on the skin. Also hair growth, sometimes, especially with the sprouts, sometimes hair, scalp hair will actually get thicker with using red clover. Hair follicles have a weird relationship to the endocrine system because different hair follicles on the body respond to the same endocrine inputs with different outcomes. So, but testosterone, DHT, things like that, androgens can make hair thin on the scalp, and red clover, because it's estrogenic, is kind of anti-androgen, and so it can kind of reverse that some of the time. All right. Well, this tonight's class is a little bit short, but it's about all I've got to say for this time. Oh wait, hang on a second. Would red clover be something you could try instead of hormone therapy? Definitely. It's definitely something that people in some situations would use instead of hormones. A lot of people use it for menopausal type symptoms, for instance, hot flashes and night sweats and things like that. It usually works. It just kind of depends on the individual person and what's going on with them. But yeah, it usually works. And for my part, I think that it works in a wider range of people than some other herbs that are used for that situation. Like, for example, black cohosh is often used and is often promoted as an herb for postmenopausal symptoms, or as an herb, kind of an herbal alternative to hormone replacement therapy. And there's a lot of difference in outcomes in the different studies looking at black cohosh, and it probably has to do with how good the products were that were used. But my experience with it in my own practice has been that it doesn't tend to work very well for people who don't have a uterus anymore. And red clover, that's not as much of an issue for it, since it is more directly acting as an estrogen rather than just trying to stimulate the body to produce more of them. Yeah. So yeah, it is something that can be and often is used as an alternative to going on synthetic hormones or bioidentical hormones or anything like that. All right. Well, I guess that's about all I have for this time, and I will talk to everybody again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks. Nice.
Thank you.
You